Welcome to H360 Health Talk. I'm here with Brian Mayer, and as you all know, a couple of weeks ago, we did a segment with Mr. and Mrs. Lesko about the loss of a child. Today we're going to be meeting with Brian Mayer. We're going to be talking about the loss of a parent. But before we get started with our health talk, I just want to give you a little background on Brian. Brian is the co-founder and managing partner of a firm called RMR Wealth Management. He's been managing assets for high net worth individuals, small business owners, and institutional clients since 1995. Brian's practice focuses on delivering unique solutions to match the goals and objectives of his clients, whether they be a high net worth individual or an institution. In 2004, Brian worked closely with the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation in a variety of fundraising efforts, principally as the chairman of the Mark Mayer Memorial Golf Tournament. He graduated from the University of Rhode Island with a bachelor's degree of science in finance. He lives in Princeton, New Jersey with his wife and two children. Brian, welcome to the table for the first time.
David, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Brian, there's so much I want to talk to you about the golf outing and the charity that you've established, but why don't we start by having you just give me a brief summary of yourself and your family?
Sure. I grew up out here in the Princeton area. My wife, Heather, I have two children, Morgan, who's a 15-year-old, also in a high school here locally at West Windsor, and my daughter, Ava, who's in 7th grade. That's my family here.
And you're involved in sports, and I know you coach, and you coach your son's team for a while.
Yeah, coaching sports, youth sports, is clearly a passion of mine. I've coached both my son and my daughter, football, basketball, baseball, softball, you kind of name it, wherever I can kind of volunteer and help the community. I enjoy doing that.
Now, Brian, we're here to talk about the loss of a parent, and unfortunately, you've lost both of yours. Your father passing first, and you were at a very young age. Tell me a little bit about when you first heard that he was diagnosed and what he was diagnosed with.
Yeah, so I was in college at the time, and I remember coming home one time for break. We were all sitting in the kitchen, and we started talking about cancer, and that we kind of made a statement to each other that that's a word that was going to have to be used quite often in our family. So I was in college. I was an only child, so had no other siblings. So it was really just the three of us talking about it, discussing it, and figuring out how we were going to tackle it.
And back then, I mean, even still today, it's almost a little taboo to talk about cancer, right? I mean, I could remember back when I was a child growing up, and I had an aunt that had cancer, and the family, the adults would gather in one room, and the kids were never exposed to that. In fact, they referred to it as the C word. They never really said the word cancer.
Right. No, it's I remember getting a couple of pamphlets and brochures, and that was really about all the assistance that we had gotten on how to really handle so many things that goes on with fighting a disease like cancer.
Yeah. So when you think back, what were some of those things? Did you and your mother and father work and put together a list of things that would need to be addressed, or what was the first step in kind of understanding it and beginning to tackle the situation?
Well, one of the most difficult parts was not really completely knowing what the protocol was going to be for trying to fight the disease, the treatments, what the effects would be of those treatments, both physically and emotionally on a family. So a lot of it is just kind of going with the flow as it comes about. So, originally, my father had multiple myeloma, so the majority of the people out there didn't even know what multiple myeloma is. It's a blood cancer, very similar to leukemia. And in today's world, there's a lot more information out there about it. But, my father was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. He was donating blood, and they did a test on the blood, and they saw that something was wrong. And so at the time he was feeling fine and, had no effects on, he was working. So it was really a big surprise to us. So it's very difficult to try and, map all these different things out that you're going to have to do.
So he's donating blood,
Mm-hmm.
and the institution calls him up and says something doesn't look right.
You need to go for further tests.
We need you to come back in, or we need you to go see another physician and
That's
get
right.
some tests run.
That's right.
And so between that period of time where he got that call that something didn't look right to the time he was officially diagnosed, what period of time was that?
It was probably a couple of months. I mean, I don't remember exactly the timing, of that. Probably a couple of months.
And so you'd mentioned that back when your father was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, it wasn't a condition that was very well known. I mean, it was. What were some of the things that you did, or how did you and your family work with your physicians to better understand what exactly this type of blood cancer was?
Well, one of the things was that there weren't many hospitals in the area that even really knew how to treat it. So we went down to St. Francis down in Trenton, where they had some doctors working it on there. And then in the long term, eventually we ended up at Little Rock, Arkansas, where there was a group of specialists that were focusing on trying to find ways to combat the disease. And it was there, and I believe Texas had one other area, but those were really the only two specialties. This is, early 90s, that had areas of ways for any type of treatment. But everything was very, I'd say, experimental, and there wasn't a lot of history on it, so we just kind of kept going with the recommendations.
Now, when you say experimental, were there clinical trials being conducted at that time, or?
It was early on. There was, a lot of talk about taking out the blood, cleaning it, putting it back in, things like that. So it was like a form of dialysis and things like that. And then eventually it led to a full-blown bone marrow transplant that he had gotten from an anonymous donor. And eventually he had the operation, but his body couldn't recover from it, and that's actually eventually what he actually passed from. He couldn't recover from the bone marrow transplant.
So you're in college at this time. You're home.
College, then at the very end, I just started working.
You started working.
Yeah.
So, how from afar did you try to support your mother through this process? Or she's here, and you're going to Trenton, and then we'll talk in a minute about another treatment center that was out of state where your father was being treated. What was the support like for both your mother being there, you being in college, and then what were some of the things that you did for support? I would imagine, you're a young man, you're in college, and your father's diagnosed, and you're away from the family. What were some of the things that you did to kind of relieve some of that stress?
Sure. So good friends and family are always there, for me to talk to. And there had been some cancer in my family in the past, so there were some people who had understanding of it. But he was very young. He was in his 40s, so this was also at the time it was a lot of, okay, this is just how we're gonna fight it and beat it. I don't think until the very end, I don't think a lot of people thought he was actually going to lose the battle. He was a strong guy, athletic guy, was working when he was able to, but there were times the treatments would tire him out, or if he was traveling to other places for treatments, he wouldn't be able to work. So my mother did a wonderful job of keeping everyone together. She was working at the time, and just trying to keep everything organized. And I was away 4 hours away, so when I would come home, it'd be a little easier on her. But when I was away, she was handling everything.
So one of the treatment centers wasn't just around the corner. It required them to travel quite a ways. Where was that, and what was that like when they had to travel out of state for treatment?
Right. So, like I said, we decided to go to Little Rock, Arkansas, which I had never spent. I don't think anyone in my family had spent 1 minute in Arkansas in their entire life. But this was the recommendations of where the specialists were. So he would go there for long periods of time. So we ended up taking an apartment there. So when you talk about that, my mother was now managing 2 residencies, right?
Yeah.
Because in the beginning we were doing a hotel, but then when we realized we were going to be there a lot longer, she took an apartment, and that in itself, was challenging just to have 2 different residences. And at the time when we got the apartment, there was a wonderful charity, a family services charity locally in Little Rock, Arkansas, that was able to give my mother some financial assistance. I think they helped her with some of the bills, and they helped get her some groceries, which is where, you and I kind of came up with that idea with Vital Options of something that we could do for people. But, and then what we had is we had family and friends that would fly down to Arkansas. My mother's sister, other cousins, relatives, would go down there and spend some time, and everyone kind of chipped in to give the support, because my mother did have to come back to work, to this, to our regular house and things like that. So very difficult on families, friends, to try and juggle all of this.
So when your father gets to Little Rock, did the treatment protocol shift from what was happening here in New Jersey and Trenton to what he was experiencing in terms of treatment in Little Rock?
A couple of times they tried different things. I mean, there was different things that they were trying to do to cure it. So sure, it changed numerous times.
Yeah.
Very early on, very experimental, not really sure how to get it under control, versus today when there's a lot of treatments for multiple myeloma.
So were they seeing progress in the treatment, or was it things would look good for a period of time and then
Very much up and down.
is it one step forward, 2 steps back?
Yes, it was very up and down.
Yeah. And so your father ends up losing his battle to multiple myeloma, and you decide that we need to find a cure, we need to do research, we need to raise money. There's so many things that we need to do just to simply understand what multiple myeloma is, let alone trying to find a treatment. So you decide that you're going to get involved in a big way and start raising some money to support the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. Tell me about the things that you did, and how did you go about doing that, and how did you raise the money?
Right, so my father passed away in 1996. I was in my early 20s, when he passed, right? So I was early on in my career. So at the time, very difficult to talk about, very difficult emotionally, things like that. But then I got married in 2001. I had my son Morgan in 2003, and then a couple of years after that's when I said, hey, I'm ready to do this now. So my wife and myself, we went to a large, the first fundraiser we went to, the MMRF has a huge gala up in Greenwich, Connecticut every year. And we just volunteered at that to just try and help the organization raise money. It's one of their largest fundraisers of the year, but also try and start learning everything that goes into running a charity event, which in itself can certainly be a full-time job. And then after that, I was, my father and myself always enjoyed playing golf, so I decided, hey, let me run a charity golf event. Let me try and do that as a way to, one, celebrate his life, celebrate one of his passions, and then raise money to try and help, find a cure. So we started doing charity golf events. We did it for 9 years. Each event would raise somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $40,000.
Wow.
And we were able to send quite a bit of money over those 9 years to the MMRF. And then as we kind of moved along, one of the things that I was very proud of is we started honoring some doctors that specialize in the field, and a couple of the doctors were actual physicians from Little Rock, Arkansas, that had moved to the East Coast. Some of them worked in the city, some of them worked in Hackensack, and brought their expertise to some of the larger cancer centers here in the East Coast. So we're able to bring them up, honor them, friends, family, community, people in the industry. We're able to celebrate with them, all the work that they had been doing all the way back, since the early 90s.